Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy to have you here. Today's webinar is an update on using the Pollinator Habitat Scorecard. We're particularly highlighting some of the updates in the most recent version that was issued earlier this year, version 2.1. And this is a scorecard that was developed by the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, a number of our industry partners. So we're excited to have with me Erik and Dan, and we'll be again sharing those updates and how you can be utilizing this scorecard, particularly as you think ahead to monitoring for pollinator habitat next year. Before we get started, I have just a couple of quick logistics items that I wanted to point out. Everyone is on mute except for myself and Erik and Dan, but we will have some time at the end for questions and actually the opportunity to unmute you if you have a particular thing you'd like to share as part of our discussion at the end. Otherwise, please feel free to submit any questions or comments that you have in your questions chat box at any point during the webinar, and we'll save those for discussion at the end. Also, if you're having any sort of technical issues, use that same chat function and we will try to respond as quickly as we can. So this webinar also is part of what we are calling the virtual Roundup. Thank you. Okay, which is new for the working group this fall. As we've transitioned to everyone being online, we're trying something new, highlighting a number of different topics for discussion over the course of 4 weeks. This is currently week 3 of the virtual Roundup. And as you can see here, our topic is monitoring and tracking pollinator habitat. So right in line with the topic of the webinar today. So we will be talking primarily about, again, the Rights of Way Working Group Pollinator Scorecard, but really encourage you to join us on the discussion board where we will be continuing to discuss the Pollinator Scorecard as well as some larger monitoring and tracking type questions. If you've not been to the discussion board before, it's really quite easy. You log into the Rights of Way Working Group website. If you don't have a login account, you can easily create one. It's free. And from there, you go to the working group access portion of the website, and then below that, the discussion board. And again, you'll see a variety of different topical threads, one of them being tracking and monitoring habitat. And we welcome you to join us there to continue the discussion. We are also recording today's webinar, and we will post a recording of the webinar to the Rights of Way Working Group website as well. So again, really happy to have with me today Erik Anderson from Environmental Incentives, Dan Salas from Cardno, again myself, Iris Caldwell from the University of Illinois Chicago. And again, we will be presenting the topic and updates today about the Pollinator Scorecard. To give you a sense of the flow for the discussion, we are first going to start with just a quick overview of the Pollinator Habitat Scorecard, how we've gotten to this point, to give those of you who may be less familiar with the scorecard some of that background. Then I'm going to turn it over to Erik to really walk through some of the specific updates that were made in version 2.1, as well as generally talk about the use of the Pollinator Scorecard and the assessment protocol itself. Then Dan is going to talk about using the management module and how that can help inform your understanding of the habitat that you have on your landscape. And then we'll close with a couple of updates and what you can expect as far as next steps as we look ahead to 2021. And then, as I said, we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So just as a good framing first step, the question that I think is important to make sure we're all kind of on the same page is, when we talk about pollinator habitat, what are we referring to? And specifically, what are we referring to when we talk about pollinator habitat on energy and transportation lands? This was something that the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group really tackled a couple of years ago, and we developed this definition using definitions that we've taken from other places and modified it really again for the energy transportation scope. But what we like to think of as pollinator habitat is habitat that contains native flowering plants, host plants, and nesting sites throughout the growing season. And we recognize that that might be remnant natural habitat that's already out there in the landscape. It might be habitat that's enhanced through management practices, or it might be very intentional, newly created habitat that energy companies or departments of transportation are creating on their lands. We also recognize the importance of native plants, although there's some value, obviously, that's provided by non-native flowering plants as well. But by focusing on native plants, we're ensuring a good diversity of floral resources, host plants, and nesting sites that are appropriate for the region that you're operating in. And then the other goal is to ensure that we have ideally 3 or more native plant species that are blooming throughout each the spring, the summer, and the fall. So you have that continuous availability of the nectar resources throughout the seasons that monarchs and other insect pollinators need them. So next, from the pollinator habitat definition, the working group then worked to develop the scorecard itself. And the scorecard was really intended to be a framework that provides a common language that energy companies and departments of transportation can use to talk about the habitat that they have on their systems and the habitat that they're managing. Provides a consistent valuation method across these different energy and transportation sectors, and very intentionally aligns where possible with existing habitat assessments and reporting protocols that are out there. It was also really important that we provide a flexible tool. We have a multi-tiered tool, which I will discuss shortly, that really provides flexibility for different types of users that are trying to answer potentially different types of questions to be able to have a tool that is useful for their needs. And also provides us the opportunity to improve the quality of that monitoring and the depth of that monitoring over time. And then lastly, the purpose of the scorecard really was to provide a framework that we could have for communicating between organizations and across sectors and facilitate some of that shared reporting to help us understand more broadly the value of pollinator habitat, and in particular, the value of rights-of-way and other energy and transportation lands for creating that habitat. So there's 3 components to what we call the Pollinator Scorecard. The first are a series of assessment protocols, which are the scorecards that you use in the field. Then we have a second component, the management module, which helps to inform the management practices that you're using and how those may impact or interact with the habitat that you already have in the landscape. And then we have the user's guide, which, much like you could probably imagine from the title, is the guidance document that helps tie the assessment protocols in the field to the management module and how to work with both of those. So as I mentioned earlier, what was really important for us is that we have flexibility and multiple functionality in the scorecard to accommodate, again, different types of users and different purposes that they might have. So we have 3 tiers to the scorecard. Tier 1 is the most basic assessment, really just serves as an indication of whether pollinator habitat might be present on your site. Tier 2 is a little bit more in-depth, actually provides a habitat quality score, and that again gives you an indication of potentially the quality of that habitat that you have on site. And then lastly, tier 3 is more involved and really gets into the composition of those plant species and the value of that diversity in providing that pollinator habitat function. So the selection of your tier, again, will be dependent on the type of information that you want to collect, potentially the time that you have to do the assessment, and then the expertise that you have, maybe in terms of plant identification skills or otherwise, that will inform, again, your selection of each tier. So now I'm going to go into a little bit more of the who, where, when, why aspects as we think about, again, the scorecard. So as we were, again, defining the scope of the scorecard, it was really important that, again, we think about the different types of users that need a scorecard like this. And again, we recognize that that may range from folks that are coming at habitat and assessing habitat from the perspective of compliance with environmental regulations or corporate sustainability. So those types of more desktop office-based folks, we broadly classify as our wingtips. So they're the folks that are really interested in taking the data from the habitat and being able to incorporate that again into maybe sustainability initiatives or strategies that you might have within your organization. We also recognize there's groups of folks that are out in the field, maybe on a daily basis, interacting with this vegetation and have the ability to make decisions about management that may impact that habitat quality. So they may be looking at and assessing habitat from that particular lens. So we broadly group those folks as our steel toes, who again are maybe looking for specific things. And then lastly, we have our TIVAs, which are our groups of what you could probably consider the habitat nerds out there who really want to get out there and find the specific plants that they're looking for. They have, that more detailed background to be able to identify and assess the quality of particular habitat resources. And so broadly, again, we're overgeneralizing the types of users here, but I think that really helps, again, to inform the different types of users that could potentially find value in the Pollinator Scorecard, as well as think about the different types of questions that they might be asking. In terms of where this habitat can occur, where you would be doing the assessments themselves, there's a lot of flexibility, and that was very intentional. We wanted to provide a tool that would essentially allow an energy company or transportation agency to assess habitat anywhere on their system, be it a linear right-of-way or maybe some other type of parcel that, again, they may have some intentional habitat or otherwise naturalized areas that they want to assess. We recognize that there are a number of other specialized tools out there. For instance, a number of states have developed solar pollinator habitat scorecards that may be more appropriate in some instances. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as you think about the use cases or how you intend to use the scorecard. And we also recognize that the more data you can collect, so if you're looking at assessing a particular area, the more points that you can identify and collect data, the better your data and results will be. And that's something that Erik will touch on a little bit more in his presentation. And then in terms of when, so when do we want these assessments to occur? It was also very important for us when developing the scorecard that we have a very streamlined process, which of course can be a challenge when you're trying to assess something as complex as habitat quality. But we designed the scorecard to be able to be performed in a single visit. So you go to a site, single time, and conduct the assessment of what you see on that site that particular day. Because of that, we really recommend that users use the scorecard during ideally peak bloom season. So when you would have the largest number and variety of plants blooming. But we've also built into the design of the scorecard this concept of potentially flowering nectar plants, which is again intended to help us capture plants that either have recently bloomed or no longer blooming, or may bloom in the future. So that's something else, again, to take in mind as you think about what you might be looking at or finding when you're out on the landscape. And then lastly, we get to the why. So again, hopefully by this point, you are already involved and interested in habitat. That's why you signed up for this webinar today. But it's important to think about, again, the basic objectives to why we would be doing habitat assessments. One obvious one would be to essentially assess that habitat quality that you have on your system, to gather a better sense and inventory of where you have habitat, particularly where you have high quality habitat, and how that may be impacted by different management practices that you have on your lands. Second, can be to inform management decisions. So with this data on habitat quality, that may influence how and where you do vegetation management activities. So that's another potential objective, particularly as you think about how habitat trends may change over time. There's an important component of communicating and learning about this habitat quality. So we mentioned potential sustainability strategies or sustainability reporting, that data from the scorecard can be used to inform that as well. And some of you may also be familiar with the Monarch CCAA program, which also has monitoring requirements, and I will talk to here just on the next slide. But the scorecard can be used to meet those monitoring requirements as well. So a little bit more about the Monarch CCAA. In short, the CCAA stands for Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. This is a voluntary pre-listing mechanism that the Fish and Wildlife Service has that essentially incentivizes partners to commit to doing proactive voluntary conservation, in this case for the monarch butterfly. And in exchange, they receive regulatory assurances that if the monarch butterfly were to become a listed species, they would not be required to do additional conservation work or would have additional restrictions or requirements upon them. So it's a really unique tool that's very innovative in helping to promote this conservation work on the lands, but also provide a lot of operational flexibility, particularly in the event that the monarch butterfly becomes a listed species. So this particular agreement that we finalized earlier this year aims to create more than 2 million acres of habitat on energy and transportation lands across the USA. And we've had a lot of interest and participation in the CCAA so far, and again, might be one of the drivers that you might have to using the scorecard and helping to monitor the habitat that you're creating for monarch butterflies. So just again to help frame the Pollinator Scorecard conversation in that light, the Monarch CCAA has 2 primary criteria that are used for monitoring. One is to assess whether milkweed is present on your plot. And there's actually 2 thresholds that are used. And you can see here in the map off to the right, the dark green Midwest Northeast region has a minimum threshold of 6 milkweed stems or more per sampling plot. So you have to exceed that threshold in order to meet the minimum requirements of maintaining monarch habitat. And in the west and south, so the lighter green portion, that threshold is 2 milkweed stems or more per plot. In addition, the second criteria is to look at the cover, so the nectar plant cover of potentially flowering plants. And this is actually just an optional monitoring threshold in that darker Midwest Northeast region, but it is a required monitoring metric for the south and west or lighter green segment. So milkweed stems and nectar plant cover are the 2 primary criteria that the Monarch CCAA requires for effectiveness monitoring. If you're interested in learning more about the specifics of that and the additional requirements and adaptive management and all those components, I encourage you to check out this video tutorial that's available on the Rights Away Working Group website that goes into that additional detail. A second related project I wanted to briefly highlight is the Rights of Way as Habitat Geospatial Database, which is a platform that we've created to serve as a central repository for energy companies and departments of transportation to report in where and how they are managing habitat on their systems. This is really intended to help facilitate collaborations between different energy companies and departments of transportation or their partners. Also, very importantly, helps us gather more aggregate data on the quality of habitat and the availability of that habitat across the energy and transportation landscape, which is really informative for engaging with resource agencies at a state or federal level, or other key stakeholders, or even the public, to continue to convey the conservation value that these energy and transportation landscapes provide. The database also provides a mechanism to support tracking and reporting for the Monarch CCAA as well. So that's another benefit of participating. Okay, so we're going to take just a moment and hear from you to help shape some of our future discussion. We'd like you to respond to this poll. And we're curious to know if you have used the scorecard or the management module, either this version 2.1 or any of the earlier versions that we've had over the past several years. And we'll give you just a couple more moments to respond. Looks like about 2/3 of you have responded. Okay, just a couple more seconds and we'll close the poll. Okay, we can go ahead and close it, Caroline. Great, and can you share the results too? Okay, excellent. So great to see we have a lot of newbies on the call. So this is perfect in terms of, again, helping to get a better understanding of where you all are coming from, and hopefully you find this webinar and some of the examples we'll go through helpful as you think about potentially using the scorecard going forward. For those of you who've just used the scorecard, I hope that this also provides an opportunity to share a little bit more about that management module. That's kind of the next step to understanding the habitat that you have out there. And it looks like we might have one person at least who's used both the scorecard and the management module, which is great to see. So when we get to the discussion section, you might be able to provide some insight there as well. Okay, so before let's see, Caroline, can you? Thank you. Okay. So before I turn things over to Erik, I wanted to just also highlight and put in context the version 2.1 in the scheme of the work that we've been doing this past year. So it was, again, we released the initial version of the Pollinator Scorecard last summer, I guess it was. That was version 1.1, had some initial field testing, got some feedback. And so at the start of phase 2, we knew that there were some updates that we wanted to make, particularly with the finalization of the Monarch CCAA. So we've been working with our industry partners to make those updates, again, which we'll present today. We're in the process of developing a suite of training materials and reference sheets, which we'll also touch on. But then as far as next steps, we envision also creating a more formal continuous improvement process or a governance board that will help shape the future development of the Pollinator Scorecard as we move forward. We also really hope to have a strong push next year to really gather and monitor pollinator habitat across the country and really use those results to help, again, inform any trends or patterns that we see, as well as potentially evaluate potential modifications or revisions to the scorecard in the future. I want to take a moment also to recognize the support of our phase 2 sponsors, whose involvement and support throughout phase 2 has been absolutely crucial in order to facilitate and allow us to do this work. So again, I want to thank these organizations for their continuous support and interest in seeing this Pollinator Scorecard succeed. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Erik to talk through some of the specific updates in version 2.1.
Great, thanks, Iris. So today I'll be walking you through some of the changes made to the Pollinator Scorecards to reach version 2.1. And I'll also provide a simple example of how the scorecards can be used as part of a vegetation monitoring program with a special focus on using the scorecards on adopted acres for the CCAA. So why update? Well, first, the Monarch Butterfly CCAA was finalized earlier this year, and we wanted to make a few changes just to bring the scorecards to be more consistent with the CCAA, and we'll see those changes in Tier 1. Also, we received a lot of great user feedback, so I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who provided feedback, who used the scorecard, and either wrote in or reached out to one of us to share your experience. And the most common refrain that we heard from folks is the habitat quality ratings were not really aligned with what people were seeing in the field. So that'll be one of the bigger changes that we made to the scorecards. It's just to bring those ratings in line with the types of habitats that we're seeing on rights of way. So we're seeing that rights of way can host really high quality habitat, and the new habitat quality ratings are going to allow you to differentiate from those really exemplary sites to the sites that might need more attention. So I'll walk through the scorecards one at a time so we can see the changes made to each. I'm having just a little trouble advancing the slide. Caroline, nope. There we go. All right, so the Tier 1 scorecard, just as a reminder, is a really rapid assessment. It just has a couple questions, and it's really designed to determine whether there is or is not pollinator habitat within the plot. So we're looking at the percent cover of potentially blooming nectar plants and milkweed abundance. The required questions are really related to those CCAA thresholds around nectar plants and milkweed abundance. And we've added some optional questions around those as well. So the changes that we've made to Tier 1 are really aligned with increasing that consistency with the CCAA. Most importantly, you're going to notice that there are now two Tier 1 scorecards. They're regionalized versions for the Midwest and Northeast or for the South and West. And that allows us to reflect those different threshold requirements for the CCAA within those regions. So you're also going to notice that the optional fields have changed. We've expanded the optional fields to include the potentially flowering nectar plant cover within a number of different ranges, so you can provide the approximate cover of nectar plants, and then also the approximate or exact abundance of milkweed. So the idea here is that we recognize that a lot of our Tier 1 scorecard users are going to be primarily focused on compliance with the CCAA, and by asking the kind of the same questions in two different ways, we provide a little insurance or kind of two different pathways for making sure that the habitats that do meet those CCAA thresholds reflect that with the scorecard. So we did drop a couple optional questions from the Tier 1 scorecard. If you were using those are now in the Tier 2 scorecard, as they've always been. So I'd encourage you to bump up to the Tier 2 scorecard if you were using all of the optional fields in the original Tier 1 scorecard. I'd also just make a plug for using the Tier 2 scorecard here. If you're filling in all of the optional fields of the Tier 1 scorecard, you're almost to filling out the Tier 2 scorecard. So consider bumping up to the Tier 2 scorecard if you're filling out all of the optional fields here. So let's look at the Tier 2 scorecard. This scorecard is going to give you a little bit more information on your habitat. So we'll be asking about the percent cover of potentially flowering nectar plants, pollinator habitat resources, the number of different nectar plant species currently in bloom, and the abundance of milkweed. And with the Tier 2 scorecard, you're going to get a habitat quality rating. So it's not just a yes/no determination of habitat within the plot. It'll actually give you one of those habitat quality ratings, and we'll take a look at those in just a second. So changes to the Tier 2 scorecard, we've clarified a little bit in the instructions and made sure that we reflected the requirement for the CCAA that monitoring plots be located randomly. We've also, and this is probably the most significant change, is we've added scoring bins for the number of flowering nectar plants species currently in bloom. So previously we had 2, and we've expanded that to 4. And that just gives us a little bit more ability to distinguish different habitat qualities based on that species diversity. I do want to make the point here, though, that we're not requiring Tier 2 users to be able to identify to the species level. So we're really, if you're not a botanist, that's okay. What we're really just looking for is how many different color or different appearing types of flowers are there. So we're going up to a maximum of 10 here. And so we think that most of our users at the tier 2, even if they can't identify to the species level, will be able to distinguish up to 10 different plants within the plot. So that's the big change there. We did also add an optional field for the exact milkweed stem count. Some of you had said that you were writing that in anyway, so now we have a place to track that. And finally, if you flip the tier 2 scorecard over, you will find those threats and opportunities section, and it includes a reminder to fill those out into the management module. We'll talk about that a little bit later today. So finally, the tier 3 scorecard. This is your most robust assessment. This is going to give you all of the information from tier 2 with the addition of questions about native nectar plants and invasive or noxious weeds. There's also a worksheet on the second page of the tier 3 scorecard that allows you to collect species lists and the abundance per species, so you can really track the change in composition over time. So tier 3 requires a little bit more expertise. You will be required to identify to species level, but it gives you really great information that you can use to track those sites that have really high quality habitat. We didn't make any changes to the tier 3 scorecard except for some minor clarifications in formatting. So I'll go on now to the habitat quality ratings. So as I mentioned before, we've really revamped the habitat quality ratings. As you can see here, you have to be using a tier 2 or tier 3 scorecard to get a habitat quality rating. And we've also changed the naming conventions. What we've heard from folks is that the names that we used in the past were not very clear. So we've used a more straightforward naming convention. There will be habitats with opportunities for improvement, or basic habitat quality, moderate habitat quality, high habitat quality, and then at tier 3, the exemplary habitat quality bucket. So notice that there's between tier 2 and tier 3, there's a slight incentive to use tier 3. You'll notice that you need 5 fewer points in tier 3 to achieve the same habitat quality rating. And that's both an incentive to use tier 3, and it reflects the fact that we just have better quality data in order to assign those habitat quality ratings. The other thing you'll see with tier 3 is that exemplary habitat quality rating. It's only available with tier 3. That's because we are asking about native species, we're asking about noxious weeds, and we really need that information to say whether a site is or is not exemplary. So consider using tier 3 if you have really high quality habitat sites, or your objectives for monitoring are around communication with the public around the quality of your habitats. So which tier to select? We've covered this a little bit in the past and today, so I won't go into this in too much more detail, but the idea is simply that as you increase the tier, you're going to get better quality data. So with the tier 1 scorecard, we're really just determining whether there is not habitat on site. With tier 2, we're going to get that qualitative habitat quality rating. And then with tier 3, we actually get that species composition information, and we can track progress over time in terms of the changing abundance of native nectar plant species or invasive and noxious weeds. Keep in mind that also as the tiers go up, it's going to take a little bit more effort, a little bit more training, and a little bit more expertise. I'll just make the point again that our users don't need to be able to identify plants to the species level except for at the tier 3 level. It would certainly help with tier 2, but again, we're just asking for the different types of blooming plants that are out there. So keep that in mind as you're selecting a tier. We also encourage you to have just a little bit of training for the folks that are out there collecting the data, more training as you go up in tier, just so you make sure you have consistency over time. The other point to make here is that any one of these tiers can be used to meet the CCAA biological effectiveness monitoring requirements. One last thing to point out, you can mix and match tiers. So if you decide that you want to use tier 2 across most of your adopted acres, that's that's great. You can also use tier 3 on those sites where you've really invested a lot of management resources. So if you're using a higher cost seed mix, or you're really focused on those areas in terms of improving pollinator habitat, consider using the tier 3 on that subset of habitat. So now we're going to take a break and talk, or we're going to poll you guys on which tier you're most likely to use. So go ahead and fill in which tier you're most likely to use, or which tier you've used in the past. And Iris, let me know when everyone's responded.
Just about half so far. Okay, just a couple more minutes or seconds, I mean. Okay, why don't we close the poll?
Great. So we got a majority opting for tier 2, and a few tier 1, and a few tier 3. Excellent. All right. So now we're going to talk about planning for monitoring a little bit, and we're going to transition into talking through the example for today. So the point I want to make is that monitoring does not need to be complicated. Certainly as your scale increases, as the complexity of your management increases, as your need for data increases, you want to invest more in planning for monitoring. But if you're just getting started, you're not really sure what to do, consider just getting out there and collecting some data. It's really going to help you start to understand the resources that's required, the tier of scorecard you want to use, and the training that you might want to go through. So as you're planning for monitoring, these are some things to think through before you get started. We are working on a little additional guidance here in a template that will look something like this, so that you can fill that out. And we're going to kind of walk through some of this today. But importantly, think about why you're monitoring. What is it that you want to detect out there? Think about the types of management that you're going to apply across your landscape and what changes you might expect. And once you've thought about that context, it's important to line out your management and sampling objectives. So we'll look at some examples today. But that's really where we get specific about monitoring requirements. And that'll allow us to then go through the sample design, where we'll look at the geographic extent, which tier we want to use, the number of plots we'll need, how we'll distribute those plots, and when and how frequently we want to collect data. Finally, plan to analyze the data. I've seen, a lot of field data sheets feed file cabinets, so don't do that. Think about how we're going to analyze the data before we even go out there. And then come up with a response plan. If you don't see the types of scores that you want, what might you do about it? Finally, think about who's going to do what resources would be required, and then reporting. Who's going to get which information, both internally within your organization and externally. So another poll here. Let's just pause quickly and we'll ask what your purpose for monitoring is.
And I'll just note that you can select multiple here. Okay, about 2/3 have responded. We'll give people just a couple more seconds. Okay, we can close the poll.
Great. So yeah, majority meet the Monarch CCAA reporting requirements. Also evaluate habitat trends over time and characterizing habitat on the system today. Great. So now we'll walk through the example, but first I want to, let's walk through the example. We're looking at a typical utility. We have a generation site, some transmission lines, and a few ancillary facilities, 24,000 acres in total in this example, and we're going to use 60 scorecard sampling plots. This is located in the Midwest region. So in the CCAA, you can note table 14-4, the requirement for a site of this size, anywhere between 10,000 and 30,000 acres, would be to use 50 samples, 50 plots. Since we're close to that high end, we're going to take an additional 10. That'll just provide a little bit of insurance to make sure that we get the data that we need. Okay, so let's talk about the management objectives for this example. So the objectives that we're going to set are going to come in pairs. We're going to look at both a management objective and a sampling objective. So we're going to kind of focus on the first one today, and because this will be, the example is that it's our first year of monitoring. The second one is really about detecting trend over time. So let me just walk through the first one. Our objective here is to maintain greater than 7 milkweed stems per plot within our adopted acres from 2020 through 2050. Our sampling objective is to be 90% confident that milkweed stem density is within 1 stem per plot within those acres. So the CCAA requires that we meet a threshold of 6 stems per plot. So why set the management objective at 7? Well, the idea is, if you look at this with the sampling objective, our range, if we're successful, will be between 6 and 8 milkweed stems with our 90% confidence interval, because our margin of error is plus or minus 1 stem per plot. So that will demonstrate with confidence that we've exceeded that objective. So that's why we've set it at 7 with the sampling objective of plus or minus 1. We've distributed the plots across the adopted acres here, and the tool that I've used for this is the Jornada Institute's Spatially Balanced Sampling tool. There's a link to it here in the deck. It's a tool that I use a lot, I recommend a lot. It's a great tool for distributing plots randomly, but also in a spatially balanced way so that we can characterize habitats all across our system. If you have Esri ArcGIS, they have a very similar tool available with the Geostatistical Analyst license if you have access to that. So we've got 60 plots spread across our system. And the next thing we need to decide is, are we going to use the scorecard or Survey123? With Survey123, the data gets uploaded automatically to the Geospatial database. So that's a great feature there. The scorecard, if you prefer taking notes in the field, you can use the scorecard. It's also a fillable PDF if you like to use it that way. So let's pause quickly and ask, what is your preferred format? Which format would you typically use, either the scorecard or Survey123?
Okay, we have about half people responding. Okay, we can go ahead and close the poll.
Great, all right. So about 2/3 prefer Survey123 and 1/3 prefers paper form. Great. All right, so you've gone out, you've collected 60 plots. What do we do with 60 scorecards? Well, if you use Survey123, you'll have access to the this private view of a dashboard that only you can see, and it just displays your plot data and the location of those plots. There's a number of handy widgets here. You can see down in the bottom right corner the proportion of different habitat ratings for those plots. And you can click on the plots and get a little pop-up that shows you the information related to that plot. So that's one option. It's definitely a great first cut on the information from your scorecards. But we also want to evaluate our management and sampling objectives. And when we're using sample data, it's important that we do use statistical tests. The point estimate is great. And so in this case, we'll just be looking at the milkweed density per plot averaged across those 60 plots. And we found that that was 6.5 milkweed stems per plot. But we want to go ahead and construct that confidence interval. The confidence interval is just a plausible range of values. So the formula is there. We'll need the average that we calculated, the sample standard deviation, the number of plots, and a t-table. The great thing is that we're working on a calculator for you so that we'll do the math for you. You don't have to write this down. But what we found here is that our plausible range of values is 6.5 plus or minus 1.86, so between 4.5 and 8.5 approximately. So then we can ask ourselves, did we meet our management objective? Well, maybe, right? 7 is a plausible value. 6.5 is not quite 7, but we can't say that it's not 7. But did we meet our sampling objective? No, we didn't, right? 1.86, a margin of 1.86 is greater than 1. And our goal here was to demonstrate with confidence that we've maintained greater than the CCAA threshold of 6 stems per plot. And so we didn't quite meet that. So what can we do? Well, we have a couple options. We could go take more samples. If we increase the sample size, we'll decrease the standard error of the sample and we'll tighten that confidence interval. So we might be able to demonstrate that in fact we are above that threshold. Or we could adapt our management to increase milkweed stem density, and we could change our management objective to a higher threshold and relax the sampling objective so that we've taken the right number of plots. We're going to keep that plus or minus 1.86 as our sampling objective, but we're going to maybe shoot for 8 stems per plot. So if we can increase that stem density just a little bit, we'll be able to demonstrate that we have complied with the targets in the CCAA. So I think this is a case where it's probably better to increase our investment in management rather than increase our investment in monitoring. So we can bump up that stem density, increase the habitat quality overall, and demonstrate compliance that way. So as you're thinking about how to adapt management, what can you do to increase stem density? That's where the management module can come in. That'll help you think about what practices will boost your habitat quality rating. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dan to walk through the management module.
All right, thanks, Eric. And thanks, everybody, for taking time today to learn about the scorecard and the management module and how to use it. Thinking of the poll that we had earlier, it looks like most people haven't had a chance to use the management module. So I'm hoping this can provide you a good introduction. And if you weren't aware of it or maybe you weren't sure how to use it, this gives you a chance to test it out and see how you can apply it on your own sites that you're sampling. So, let's start with the why. Why would you use the management module in the first place? It's out there. It's a tool that is really meant to sort of be a counterpart and be coupled with the scorecard. So you have habitat. You're taking time to invest in monitoring to understand what condition it's in. But then what? These are sites that we're investing time and money and effort into. So we want to make sure we're managing those to the best of our ability. And so, the management module there is there as a tool to help you identify those management needs, to look at the threats that are present to maintaining the habitat quality, and also to think about how to improve what you already have. And then that can feed back to your scorecard potentially in future years to show improvements in quality. In doing that and using the tool, that can help you to learn and adapt your own management. to understand what's influencing habitat quality, to think about the management needs that are out there, and to think about the scale and effectiveness of the tools that you're using to manage that habitat. The end goal of all this being, again, with your learning, is that you're adapting and then you're improving your management efficiency so that the time and effort you're putting in are getting you the results that you'd like to see. So all those come together in the management module, and much like the scorecard, we'll go through an example to show what that looks like and how to use it. As we think about the management module, it's important to understand sort of the underlying rationale behind it. And when we think of habitat management, it often comes down to addressing threats that threaten to degrade the quality of the habitat, or to leverage enhancements or opportunities that can improve what we currently have. And so when you think about the range of management tools that you have out there, they can really run this spectrum from helping minimize threats to enhancing opportunities at any particular site. And so what the management module does is it looks at what the threats and opportunities are at a site and allows you to determine what can be done about those and how effective are the treatments that you've made toward those at addressing those needs. So to think about how to use it, if I break it down in just a handful of steps in terms of how you can apply the management module, it's first that you want to identify and gather the site information that you have regarding management. So you're already out there collecting scorecard information, you have your habitat quality, but you also need to know and have an understanding of what's occurring at that site for management. And so you want to gather that up from whoever's helping, assisting with that site management. Next, you also want to determine the manageable threats and opportunities that are at the site. If you're using the Tier 2, Tier 3 scorecards, those can be noted on those scorecards, and those can be used then to directly feed into the management module. So coupling that along with the managements that have occurred gives you the baseline information you need to fill out the management module. Then you want to estimate or bring in individuals that can help you estimate the scale at which those management tools have been applied, as well as their persistence. How effective are they at addressing those threats or opportunities over a general period of time. Then you review the scoring that you've received from the module, and you want to compare that along with your scorecard, and that'll help you together to indicate what you want to do next, and hopefully give you some direction in terms of how you want to continue your management. Doing that helps you to learn, again, adapt and grow and improve your management as time goes on. I mentioned the term manageable threat or opportunity, and that's something to think about. We use that in the management module, and that any particular site you have where you're restoring or enhancing or maintaining pollinator habitat is exposed to all sorts of threats and opportunities. Some of those are in your control, some of those aren't. So we consider a threat or opportunity manageable if there's a treatment that you have that's feasible to use and the conditions allow for it, if it can be appropriate and targeted to that particular threat and opportunity, and if there's other constraints that limit you or prohibit you from doing that. So, if you think about that maybe in the opposite, as we show on this table here, manageable threats are basically things that are within your control. It does not include all those things that are sort of outside of your management control or purview. And so, if you think about things like if you're doing projects on easements, there are certain easement restrictions. There could be, funding or program constraints that don't allow you to use certain tools. Or it could be bigger than that. It could be, larger offsite influences, watershed influences, climate change impacts, things like that are really outside of your control. So really focusing on what you can control at a site to, again, address threats or improve opportunities. All right. Before I jump into the example, I just want to touch on the scoring, and then we'll come back. I'll show you an example of how the scoring works out for our example site. But when we look at the management module, when we originally were getting feedback on it, we really struggled with how do we score management? Is it that you're doing more? Is it the frequency at which you're managing? And we really settled on it's the sort of ratio, as you were, to all the things that need to be managed and how well your management is applying to those. And so the way that we've tallied the score, and we'll show in the example here, is looking at the maximum score possible for the threats or opportunities that are present at a site, and evaluating based on what you're doing and then the scale and persistence of it, how well it's achieving that max. So if you can envision, there's the end zone or the goal that you're shooting for in terms of being able to address every single thing possible at a site that would control the threats and opportunities. The closer you are to getting to that gives you a better score. So let's look at that in an example. I think this will make a lot more sense as we go through and show you how it works in terms of the calculation. So let's go back to that site that we shared earlier for the scorecard. Thinking of a generation site that's part of this 24,000 acres that has these sampling plots. And in particular with this generation site, let's say that there's a pollinator area, a site that's being encompassed by one of those scorecards, and we want to do a module of that site to evaluate how management is occurring there. So this could be again, a single site, like in this case at a generation facility. If it's a large site or if it's a site that has multiple different management regimes, you could split up management module into several different sites or do a different module for each of those sites that are managed differently. So think about that as you apply this. You typically will do one management module per site, but if there are differences in site conditions or differences in how it's managed, you might want to look at different management modules for those cases. Okay, so first off, there's the sort of basic site information that you want to align with your scorecard, so you can record what the site is, track it over time. This also goes into who completes this module. And as we describe in the user guide, we're really looking for an individual that's familiar with the site and the management that's occurring. We want them to have that working knowledge of the habitat management actions that are occurring there. So when they occurred, what tools were used, how they were applied, where they were applied. And then next, being able to have that ability to make reasonable judgments that relate to the site conditions and also the effectiveness of those tools that are applied. So depending on when they complete the module compared to when the management was conducted, they can either look at the efficacy of the management that was done, or based on their professional judgment and experience, they can speak to what the efficacy will be in the future. So we want somebody who's knowledgeable of the site to then take what we have from the scorecard and that knowledge to then determine what threats are present at the site. So as I mentioned, there's threats and opportunities. And the way the module is broken up is that we look at each of those separately. And so we want to look and see if there's threats present at the site, and then within the module, select in that second column there, what manageable threats are present. And so we've pre-populated with a few of those that are common to many pollinator plantings and sites. There's also the ability to add in others if there's others that are identified. And then we want you to select recommended actions to address those key threats where those have been implemented or could be implemented. It also allows you to enter in your own recommended actions if the ones that are in the drop downs aren't necessarily suitable for that particular site. So there is flexibility there in terms of how you use that and what you enter there. Then next as you expand into the rest of the sheet there, you've identified the manageable threats, the recommended actions to address those threats, and then that next column is, were those actions taken over the past year? And so you can look at those recommended actions. In this case, we have 3 threats. We have a lack of management direction or targets or objectives. We had woody encroachment and invasive species competition. In this example, we only are addressing 2 of those 3 threats at the site. In this case, there's lack of interest in terms of controlling invasive species at this location, and so really focusing on those first 2 is what they're doing. Now with the first one, they are addressing that, and then they want to assign sort of the scale and the persistence of that treatment. And so the scale is the extent of the site that is impacted by that management treatment, and then the persistence of the treatment is how long into the future will those effects be realized at the site. So depending on what you're doing, if you're, let's say, using invasive species as an example, if you're simply mowing it down, you might remove it simply for part of a growing season, maybe a full growing season, depending on timing. If you're doing, maybe herbicide treatments, maybe it's the full season, maybe it's a few years into the future. There's different scales of persistence resulting from actions that you're taking. And so we score that out for the lack of direction targets. They define goals and management targets. As Erik demonstrated, there is some sampling objectives and management objectives. So we've addressed that at the site, and that's something that we're going to carry into the future over the long term, as we're considering 4 years or more. So that's completely addressed that threat. For woody encroachment, there was some mechanical brush removal, some forest removal that occurred. It addressed the majority of the site, not the full site. And without follow-up treatments, we're expecting that that's going to resprout, regenerate. And so that only has a limited short-term improvement over 1 to 3 years or so. So that gives a partially addressing score. And so what that does, is you can see, it takes the ratio of the threats present versus managed, and then the effectiveness of those to give us the threats managed score at the bottom. So in this case, we have 19 out of 35 points possible. Next, we'll look at the opportunities. In this case, we only identified one opportunity available at the site, which was preserving areas of dead wood or undisturbed thatch, so primarily undisturbed thatch. In that, thinking about future maintenance or management of the site, that we want to flag areas that we want to preserve that thatch, for nesting and egg laying, those types of things in the future. And so noting that as a recommended action and that's going to be done in the future addresses that opportunity so that we have that enhancement. And so in this case, we only have one opportunity that we've identified as present, but we're addressing it. And so there we're getting the full score of 25 out of 25 points for the opportunities managed score. So then what the management module does is it takes those two scores together. And again, it looks at the maximum that you could possibly have and combined with the threats and opportunities, how close are you getting to that maximum possible? In this case, we had 44 out of 60 points. That's combining the threats managed and the opportunities managed score to give you the overall management score. And so that 44 out of 60 possible gives us a grade on our qualitative rating. On that table on the right, you see we have our scoring categories. So much like the scorecards, we have scoring categories for the management module that generally align again with what we have for the scorecard. But again, depending on where we're at here, we can see where we fall. So in this case, we're at great. We're at the lower end of great. So if we want to avoid falling into the satisfactory, or if we want to improve what we can start addressing the invasive species at the site. That's an easy way that we can improve our management effectiveness based on the tool. So that's the value, I think, of the management module, is that helps you to identify where those management needs are. It helps you to think about what threats and opportunities are present and what you're doing about them, and then how effective is it. But then after you have that, I think it's worth, the real power of that comes from putting it all together with the habitat scorecard. And so, this is a sort of a conceptual, matrix, if you will, thinking about how would you use both of those together. And so if you think about on the x-axis, we have the management scores, the y-axis, we have the habitat quality. And so when we compare the management scores with the habitat quality, that can help indicate generally what you want to think about doing next for management. So, in the upper left, where we have high quality or exemplary habitat, and we have exemplary management, we're doing everything we possibly could to address everything that we need at the site. That's great. You're doing everything you need, so just keep it up. It's a great job. If you think about that, though, if we have high quality habitat, and maybe we're on the other end where we're, as far as the management module says, we need improvement, or we're only meeting some needs at the site. That's a washout scenario where that might be good now, but that habitat might degrade over time unless we start addressing some of those threats, or we take enhancements to maintain what we have. And so that quality might degrade over time, and that might be reflected in future scorecards unless we're addressing management. Conversely, if we have exemplary management, but it's at a low or basic quality site, that's where, again, you can leverage the tool to identify what else you could do to improve those scores. Or if you're doing all that you can under that exemplary management, well, then maybe this is the best possible for that site, or maybe you focus your efforts elsewhere. Certainly, if you go to that lower right corner where we have an improvement opportunity habitat, the lowest tier of scoring, and we need to improve our habitat, then that forces you to think we should really reevaluate what we're doing here, and if we're continuing that or focusing efforts elsewhere. And then, of course, across all those other ends of the spectrum and in between, this is where identifying those threats and opportunities and what you're doing for management, its effectiveness, can really help improve any number of sites with its management. So I hope that helps you kind of conceptualize how you can use that. And then, just thinking in terms of process, you want to continue to use that habitat scorecard. Couple that with using the management module at those sites where you want to evaluate your management and control and make efforts to potentially improve that. Look at those results together. So again, you can learn and adapt and grow what you're doing from there. And then adapting and using it to plan future management is the name of the game. And so then hopefully in the future, as you go back to those sites, as you go back to those needs, you'll reflect with improved scoring and for both the habitat and the management module. So with that, Iris, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So here we're wrapping up our formal presentation. Just a couple of things I want to highlight as you consider next steps, and get ready with your questions that you want to send our way for the discussion here in just a minute. But again, as you think about, okay, you've sat through this webinar, you have a better understanding, hopefully, of what the scorecard is about and management module and how these pieces play together. Where do you go from here? So if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you download the scorecard and the management module and the user's guide from the website. There's a couple of places where you can access it, but probably the most straightforward is if you go to the main Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group website, and then under Tracking and Monitoring, you select Pollinator Habitat Scorecard, and that will bring you straight to a dedicated page, and there's quite a bit of information there and some resources about the scorecard. For those of you who are familiar with the Monarch CCAA toolkit, you can also find the scorecard there as well. The next step, as Erik said, is just start small if you need to, but get out there and start using it. I think that will be the best way to get familiar with the scorecard, how it might work on your system, who you want to engage to do the scorecard assessments and the management module and so forth. So with that practice, hopefully, again, you'll start to learn some helpful insights and certainly have some data that can help shape some of your future decisions. We're very eager to hear your feedback and also see some of the results that you're finding. That will help us as we think about next steps and potential revisions. So we're very interested in particularly hearing what you think about the usability of the scorecard and the management module, the accuracy of it. As Erik said, the revisions that we made to version 2.1 were heavily informed by folks saying, hey, I scored X, and it just doesn't seem like that's a good, accurate representation of the site that I was visiting. So all of that feedback is really, really helpful for us as we think about continuing to improve the scorecard tool. We're interested in any notable patterns or trends that you're finding. I would imagine that would also be helpful and worthwhile your consideration as well. And then, as I said, any other updates or suggestions you would have for updates in future revisions. Okay. Let's see, Caroline, I'm having a delay. Thank you. Next, I wanted to go into a little bit more detail about the Survey123 platform, since that was kind of an add-on to the original paper form that we created. So many of you indicated that your preferred platform would be an electronic tool like Survey123. I would imagine many of you within your organizations are already using Survey123 or other maybe Esri products. So it's very streamlined tool and really can help facilitate collecting that data and aggregating it in whole. So if you're interested in using the Survey123 form and survey that we've created that aligns with each of the tiered field assessments, the first step is to register your organization with the right-of-way geospatial database. And again, you can do that by also going to the Rights-of-Way Working Group website. Same under tracking and monitoring, there's another page for the geospatial database, and there's a simple questionnaire you can complete and register your organization with the database. From there, you install Survey123 on your digital device that you're planning to use in the field, download the survey associated with your organization, and then start collecting. So you can collect the data in the field. You can upload photos that'll then be tied to that scorecard assessment. And then when you submit the data, it automatically syncs with the data that's in the geospatial database. You can then view or modify that scorecard entry or the data that you submit at a later date. So it provides flexibility to go in and add additional information or maybe fix an issue that you find. And then what's really cool is at the end of the year, or really at any point, you can go into the database and run a query that summarizes all of the scorecard data that you've collected over a particular time frame. So again, for those of you who are enrolled or planning to enroll in the Monarch CCAA, that's another helpful way to have all of your monitoring data together in one place. So if you have any questions about the Survey123 platform or that functionality, let us know. We are working on a separate guidance document that goes step by step through the process, and that should be forthcoming any day now. Okay, lastly, I wanted to just go through some of the other resources. I mentioned at the beginning that this is part of our phase 2 process for the scorecard. And what we really wanted to focus on in phase 2 was not only updating the scorecard to make sure that it's responsive to your needs, but also that we provided the resources and tools that you all need to be able to successfully implement the scorecard. So the things that we've heard from you all that would be helpful is a variety of different reference sheets. So we're compiling these types of resources, some of which we're shamelessly borrowing from other people who've already compiled the information. Monarch Joint Venture and Xerxes Society, for instance, have milkweed ID sheets that are really handy. They're by state, very colorful and interactive. So those sorts of tools are also available. We have a percent cover guide that helps folks who may be less familiar with estimating percent cover. There's some helpful tools like that. And then, as I mentioned, the Survey123 guidance, as well as Erik mentioned, a template for developing monitoring plans. Those types of tools we are in the process of compiling and developing based again on some of the specific needs that you identify. We're also developing a series of animated videos. The first one we just released this week in honor of our virtual Roundup this week. If you haven't already checked it out, it's a short 3-minute video just introducing the concept of the Pollinator Scorecard and the management module. Hopefully as a helpful tool if you're trying to have an internal discussion or talk to any of those SHU type users in your organization. This video should give them a good grasp of what the scorecard is about. We mentioned the discussion board early on. So again, that's a great resource to post questions, share any experiences or issues that you're having, and not only have a kind of a direct line to Erik and Dan and our team to answer your questions, but also hear from each other as far as what's working well, and again, maybe where there's some challenges. We'll plan to continue to do webinars like these, and again, make the recordings available on our website. We also plan to develop some really simple PowerPoint templates that can serve as training guidelines or training templates if you're doing internal training with folks who would be using the scorecard. Those are not yet developed, but will be coming in the next couple of months. And then some of you may remember last year, seems like a completely different era, but we were able to do a field demo, an in-person field demo as part of our fall workshop. And so obviously as the times evolve and if we're in a position to do those again, we had a lot of really great feedback with those types of events. So we hope to be able to continue to offer that type of on-site training to help folks, again, get familiar with the scorecard and how it can be used. Okay, so we have one last poll for you here. And I want you to, again, think back to those different shoe types that we introduced at the very beginning. We have our wingtips and our steel toes and our Tevas, or if you don't want to mess with that, just think about within your organization who you envision using the scorecard. And we'd like to get your feedback on that. And if you select other, feel free to chat in the chat box who you have in mind. Okay, we have half the responses so far. Just a couple more moments. Okay, looks like people are mostly done responding. Okay, so it looks like large number of you are envisioning your environmental staff, potentially interns to conduct the surveys or scorecards, vegetation management staff or contractors also, potentially other third parties, and a couple of you also selected others. So if you have any other, let's see, landscape architects, I see someone chatted in, maybe other maintenance personnel who could potentially use tier 1 or tier 2. So those are some of the other folks that you have in mind. So excellent. Okay, so we now have some time for some questions and answers and discussion. I also want to invite, first off, if you haven't submitted a question, to please do so. We have a couple that we'll work our way through here shortly. But also if you have had experience using the scorecard, a number of you indicated that you have, feel free to either chat in or raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can share, share your thoughts. And by raising your hand, I mean use the little function in GoToWebinar to raise your hand, because unfortunately I can't see you. But again, we'd love to hear from you as well. So to start off with, we have a couple of questions tied to the field assessments or the scorecards themselves. One is about the minimum size plot and whether or not we need to use a consistent plot size. Erik, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so the plot size is 1,500 square feet. So it's 150 feet by 10 feet. If you have a rectangular site, or you can fit that in, it's typically easier to sample. If not, you can do a 22-foot radius plot, but it is important that the plot be 1,500 square feet. So potentially, if you can't squeeze in either one of those two shapes, you could adjust the length and width. But it is important that it be 1,500 square feet.
Okay, great, thank you. Someone here also noted that they've been collecting data using tier 2 this past year, and specifically using the paper form. They're wondering about registering for the geospatial database and adding their data through using Survey123. So that's absolutely something that can be done, and would encourage it. In fact, you can either do it through the Survey123 platform, or we also, with the Geospatial database, have the ability to do a bulk upload. So particularly if you have ArcGIS Pro or one of those Esri products, there's also a way to do it, I believe, through ArcGIS Online. You can do a bulk upload of any of that data that you've collected. But again, using Survey123 is also an option, and that can be done after the fact. Good question. A question here about the management module. The question is, is the management module a spreadsheet tool? And yes, it currently is an Excel spreadsheet. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, it's an Excel spreadsheet, just given some of the functions that help with some of the scoring at the moment. Certainly, if there's other formats that would be preferred or easier to use, I'd be interested to get that feedback as well.
Okay. Let's see. Another question is, why is there a difference between the stem thresholds for the east and the west? The 6 milkweed stems versus the 2 milkweed stems. Also a great question. That of course relates back to the Monarch CCAA. And Dan, I'll hand that one to you again if you want to speak about how that difference came to be.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the short answer would be, well, because that's the requirement in the CCAA. But the long answer is that, the net benefit of the CCAA is somewhat tied to the core breeding area of the eastern monarchs. So that eastern zone that has a higher stem density corresponds with the general range of common milkweed. And since common milkweed is pretty clonal, when you find it, you typically find a lot of it. That caused that threshold to be higher in that part of the country.
Thank you. On that point, I also just want to reiterate, I think Erik mentioned this as well, but even though the Tier 1 scorecard was directly aligned with the CCAA monitoring requirements, you can use either Tier 1, 2, or 3 to collect data that aligns with what you need for the CCAA. So you're not limited to using Tier 1, and in fact, we would really encourage you to use Tier 2 or Tier 3 if you can to meet those CCAA requirements as well. Okay, speaking of the Tier 1 scorecard, comment here that the Tier 1 scorecard for the Northeast and Northwest indicates that the check for 10% flowering cover is required. Should that be shown as optional for the Northeast? Dan, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think we noted that as required for the Tier 1 scorecard, just so we have both of those pieces of data. It is optional as far as the CCAA is concerned. So I think we wanted that just, otherwise for the Midwest, Northeast, your only metric would have been milkweed. And so it seems like having a little more information was helpful there for the scorecard.
Yeah. Okay. Another question about the management module. Someone says, I definitely see the value of the management module. Is it required, or is it just for the purposes of evaluating and improving your management activities?
Certainly. It is not a requirement. I mean, certainly you can use the scorecard on your own and just get an assessment of the habitat quality, and you can report that to the database. The management module really it's another tool, and we felt like it's a nice complementary tool to the habitat scorecard to, again, just help assess what you're doing from a management standpoint and how it might be improved.
Great. Next question, and this kind of goes back to some of what you were discussing, Erik, thinking about the sampling process. So one of the notes here is that the CCAA requires random sampling of plots to do the effectiveness monitoring. Can you talk a little bit, and Dan, feel free to weigh in here specifically about the CCAA, but when should random plots be used, and is it necessary to meet the CCAA requirements?
Dan, do you want to talk about the CCAA requirements? I can talk a little bit more about just randomness in general.
Sure. Have some random thoughts. Yes, as far as the CCAA goes, random plot selection is a requirement. The CCAA, though, is fairly open in terms of how random plots are selected. So Erik has that great tool, which is really helpful. But random selection can just be selecting locations on a map. I think the minimum we expect for the CCAA is that you're selecting the points that you're going to sample before you actually head off in the field. So what we're trying to avoid there is that inherent bias of pulling up to a site in your truck, you get out and you look and oh, here's a good spot of habitat, I'm going to go and do an assessment over there. We're trying to uncouple that so that you're really getting a random selection of what those site conditions are. So within the CCAA, it's again pretty open-ended in terms of how you go approach that, how you go about approaching that. But certainly, if you can use GIS tools, great. If you just pick plot selections based on where you might be and just pick it down on a map, that's acceptable too. But yeah, Erik, feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, I think randomness is required by the CCAA. Systematic counts as random, provided there's some randomness to where you start. So that's important to note. I think when you're looking at linear features, often systematic sampling where we're taking a sample every 20 yards, mile, quarter mile, however you want to break it up, that's just a little bit easier to implement in the field. Pick a random starting location and then just have your folks move down and collect plot after plot. So that's an approach. There's lots of approaches to picking random points in the field, whether using a GIS ahead of time or using a grid or something else once you're actually in the field if you don't have access to a computer. When we talk about randomness, what we really mean is just any area within the adopted acres or the site that you want to characterize has an equal probability of being sampled. So if there's any reason to think that somewhere in that site just doesn't have a chance of being sampled, then we have a problem with the sampling design. Especially if we're jumping out of the truck and finding the highest quality habitat that we can find. Clearly, there's an unequal probability for the lower quality habitats to be selected. I think that's not to say that selecting a representative point in a demonstration area or a site that you're using for communication purposes is not appropriate. I think you can certainly do that. Use a representative plot that you think represents the area that you're looking at in general. Just know that that can't be bundled with the other data that you're taking randomly. That needs to just be set aside.
That's helpful. And maybe one other thing I would add, because it's something that's come up with some of the partners we've been talking to for the CCAA, is the idea of intentionally excluding maybe some areas, say highly dense urban areas, or other areas where there would be a safety issue if it was included in kind of the random sampling. But to Erik's point, I think just keeping in mind that kind of equal probability of sites in kind of your monitorable, I think that's a new word I just defined, but the potential sites where you could be doing monitoring, if there's equal probability of those sites to be selected, I think that's the key criteria to keep in mind. Okay, we have a couple questions that dive a little bit more into the actual conservation practice itself. One has to do with seeding. So for instance, this individual says that they've seeded their roadsides over the last 2 winters, but they're only seeing some results and they're seeing a real heavy invasive species presence. So the question is, will seeding these areas again this winter help to strengthen these areas in the population? Dan, or
take a gander at that. You know, the classic adage when it comes to restoring native plants is, you know, the first year it sleeps, the second year it creeps, and the third year it leaps. A lot of these plants take time to establish. You know, they often put a lot more effort initially into growing their root structure before they start doing that top growth of leaves and flowers. So I think your experience is not atypical. I think that's fairly common with new seedings, that you'll see, you know, a lot of the early successional plants coming in first thing, those early annuals that just that grow, and, you know, over time those will reduce on their own as other vegetation becomes established. Certainly, and depending on your seeding rates, it wouldn't hurt to necessarily do a supplemental seeding, but oftentimes if you're seeding at a sufficient seeding rate at the onset, you don't necessarily need to do supplemental seeding. So it is, I think, just a matter of time and doing what you can in the meantime. If you have that ability to, you know, keep some of those early successional weeds down while what you've seeded is establishing, will go a long way. So patience will be rewarded.
Great, thanks, Dan. Another question about milkweed genetics, and specifically the question is, do milkweed species tend to have strong regionally specific genetics, or are the genes more widespread due to the migratory pollinators? I don't know if either of you have more detail there in milkweed genetics, but feel free to weigh in, or we can follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I don't know my milkweed genetics offhand, but I do know just generally with a lot of native plants that you know, are dispersed with wind-blown seeds, their genetics tend to be, you know, fairly variable across a, you know, widespread area. So you know, it's not like some species that reproduce vegetatively that have very specific, you know, genotypes within, you know, say a really confined area. With wind-blown seeds and, you know, generations upon generations of establishment, those genetics can be, you know, fairly consistent, I suppose, you know, across a region. But yeah, I'd be interested in seeing some of the research on that. Those are just generalities from native plants in general.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if the question is about you know, sourcing seed or collecting, you know, seed nearby, the guidance that I've seen, and I'm not an expert on milkweed genetics, certainly is to try to find the most ecotypic seeds that you can, which, you know, collecting nearby would often be best, but you know, buying from a seed source that's also located somewhere nearby would be acceptable. So, but yeah, I'd also be interested in the answer to that question.
Okay. Well, that's a great setup, that if anyone does know the answer, please join us on the discussion board. And Caroline, if you advance one more slide, doesn't look like I have control. We have just a reminder again to join us on the discussion board. Again, if you log into the website, you can find the discussion board under the working group access portion of the website. So if you happen to have milkweed genetics background, I can help answer that question. Welcome you to share that on the discussion board. Or if you have any other questions about the scorecard or thoughts on monitoring, we'd love to see you there on the discussion board. And again, I want to thank you all. I want to especially thank Erik and Dan for your time today and all of your work on the scorecard and the management module. And we look forward to hearing from you all as you guys get out and work with the tools in the field.